My name is Charles Sydnor. I am a senator here in District 44. For those of you who don't know me, I serve on judicial proceedings, which is the committee that its jurisdiction is deals with criminal law, procedure, and the kinds of topics that we're here to focus on tonight, which is juvenile law. I would say that for the past few months, you can't go to a community association without hearing people talk about juveniles, crime that's happening to juveniles, murders and things that fall upon our juveniles, and the law that we passed, the General Assembly passed in 2022. And watch the news. In fact, there's some news channels that I believe are banning dangerous flame. And a lot of the information that I believe they've been putting out is not entirely accurate. So what I wanted to do, and I will tell you, the secretary and we met, I believe it was back in January, when he was going through the appointments process. And back then he had offered, he said, if appointed, if I needed him to reach out to him and have him come into our district, he would do so. So tonight, that's exactly what he's doing. But before we get into that, first I'd like to make certain that I thank our venue sponsor, our community partner, Morningstar Baptist Church, for allowing us to have this here tonight. So thank you all. Like this pastor just walked in. And let's see. So we're going to get started. One of the things that if you all had an opportunity, we tried to advertise this in the public. We let the public know if you had questions or anything that you wanted the secretary asked, send them to me. We're going to compile those questions. This is not one of those got you kind of sessions. We wanted really good information. So the questions that were shared with me, I shared them with the secretary and his staff. And I believe these are questions, and he's going to have answers that I believe are going to bring a lot of clarity to this issue. At the end, we'll talk. I think I have with the number of questions that we have, we'll probably reach about 8 o'clock. Just around that time, my chief of staff, Eugene Clark, he will have some index cards. So if there's something that is said during the course of this conversation that maybe you didn't send in earlier, that some sort of question that you may have, we'll have an opportunity to write down those questions, and we'll try to get through as many of them as we can. This program will stop at 8:30, but I think it's going to be robust and full of really good information. So with that introduction to the event, I would like to thank Secretary Schiraldi for being here this evening and ask if you could please provide a little bit of information about your background. How did you get here in Maryland?
Thank you, Senator Sydnor, and thanks for inviting me here today, and for all you folks for coming out on a wet Tuesday night. I appreciate it. So I started in the field right out of college in upstate New York. I was a house parent in a home that 7 juvenile delinquent boys lived in. So the job was interesting. You went to work Sunday night and you slept there all week till Friday night. So I was with them all week, and I just kind of fell in love with the field back then, and felt that a lot of these young people they'd be fun, but we don't always give them those opportunities. And I thought maybe that's something I could add. So for much of my early career, I worked in a nonprofit field. In fact, I worked for a nonprofit here in Baltimore called the National Center on Institutions and Alternatives. That's how I first got in the field. But I was doing it out of New York and California. And then I was hired to run the juvenile justice system in Washington, DC. During that time, I lived in Silver Spring, so that's where I raised my kids. Got hired by Mayor Bloomberg up in New York to run his probation department. Back down to Maryland, was my time life in Silver Spring. I met him when I was probation commissioner in New York City. He was running a foundation at a Robin Hood Foundation. And so I interviewed and got the job to do this, but my wife and I, we were gonna move back down no matter what. So I'm glad to be back in Maryland.
Gotcha, great. So I've heard from a number of constituents and colleagues. I told the staff I spent a few hours watching the hearing that you just had before the House Judiciary a few weeks back. And even in the media, we are hearing that children keep committing all kinds of crime. There's no punishment for them. You have children who are engaged in car thefts and all these kinds of crimes. However, when you look at the code, the DJS wasn't built as a punishment mechanism. It was built for rehabilitation, right?
That's right.
Would you mind talking a little bit about the mission of DJS?
Sure thing. So, you know, this is not just true here, but in every state, we had a separate juvenile justice system, specifically because we feel like young people aren't just smaller versions of adults. They're different than adults. They're not as mature, they're more impulsive, they're more easily led by their peers, and they are less future oriented. They don't really think about what's coming. They don't plan out. They don't defer gratification. And a 16-year-old is different from a 30-year-old. In a way, a 30-year-old and a 40-year-old aren't that different, right? Think about yourself. When you were a kid, you did things you're not proud of. I know personally, if I had to sit here and say the things I did when I was a kid, you know, I'd be embarrassed by it, right? They're stupid. And you just stop doing them at a certain point. Right. Somewhere around 25, the brain matures, you gain experience, you start the world of work, you start your family, and you grow out of young people's stuff. And so the notion of creating a juvenile court, which happened in the early 1900s around the United States, was that we don't want to saddle people for their whole lives for stuff they did when they were kids. And so Maryland's system is just like that in the rest of the country. So it's meant to hold young people accountable, but in a way that helps them to turn their lives around and rehabilitate to the extent, rather than just sort of punishes them and sticks them with a criminal conviction for the rest of their lives.
It seems it's that conversation around what accountability looks like. That's right. That's really where a lot of the debate is. That's right. Because how it looks with DJS is not necessarily how it looks with out in the general public with some people. Some folk are looking for incarceration. Right. But I know you had testified about some of the effects of incarcerating juveniles, right?
Yeah, well, you know, I mean, Maryland is a higher incarcerating state for its juveniles than most states are. So on average, most state systems, about 3% of the people in their prison system came in when they were juveniles. In Maryland, it's 6%, so we're twice the national average.
Twice?
Yeah, 6% here, 3% everywhere else. And there's only 4 states total, us, South Carolina, Wisconsin, I can't remember the other state where it's 6%. And it's all Black kids and brown kids. 90% of the kids that go into the adult system are either Black or Latino. And the outcomes are terrible, as you can imagine. Lots of violence happens in adult facilities, lots of sexual assaults, lots of suicides. There was a study just in July from a Journal of the American Medical Association that showed life expectancy for kids who go into the adult system is 33% shorter. So it affects everything. And rearrest rates, particularly violent rearrest rates, are higher when you go to an adult prison than when you come to juvenile. And juvenile's not perfect, but it's just better than the alternative. And think about your own children, what you would want for your own child if they got in trouble. almost nobody wanted to go to adult prison. You want us as a society to do all we can to turn their lives around, and that's what my job is.
And you touched on that a little bit in that hearing with judiciary. And I believe the statistic that you cited was that about 85% of those juveniles who are charged as adults, meaning they did some sort of really serious crime, 85% of those juveniles who are charged as adults, meaning that you start in the adult system and wave down to the juvenile system after a judge has an opportunity to hear the case.
That's right.
And what surprised me about what you said, and I hadn't thought about it until hearing, and I've been hearing about this for a while. Senator Carter's been a real champion for this type of legislation to start juveniles, and if court found it so, to waive them up to the adult system. What you had said was those 85% that are waived down, those juveniles never get the kinds of services that they would have gotten if they would have started in the juvenile system, correct?
That's right. So it's at 87%, right? And it's actually 3 different groups, right? One group, these are kids who are automatically charged as adults. So nobody makes that decision. A legislature passed that law in the 1990s, right? During a time of when we were very afraid of children and we're calling them super predators, right? And so of that 87%, some just get credit for time served and walk out, right? Some get their cases dismissed. And that's like a third get their cases dismissed. So the case just goes away. And then around 43% get returned to the juvenile system, and then a juvenile judge starts the whole process all over again. So that takes about 4 months, which is dead time for them. It's interestingly different than adults. So if you sit in jail waiting to get sentenced, and then you get sentenced to a year as an adult, that 4 months counts. But if you sit and wait for the judge to return you to the juvenile system, and then 2 more months for the judge in the juvenile system to decide what should happen to you, and then that judge sends you to one of our treatment facilities, you start at month 0. Because it's a treatment facility, so it's not like just waiting, it's treatment. So you got a whole 6 months still to do, or whatever number of months you end up doing. So the kids that I talked about during the hearing that should concern us all are the kids whose cases get dismissed. Because it's not like they didn't do it. Now, I know there might be some public defenders in the room and they're like, no, my client's innocent, but like, some of them actually did it. They just can't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So the case disappears, and now you got a kid that gets nothing. He just walks out the front door with nothing. So to deal with that, we reached out to the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention, and we got a grant jointly with the prison system, with the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, just to provide services in the city and county, Baltimore City and Baltimore County, for those kids walking out the door. And those will be voluntary because they've been acquitted, right? Or they had their cases dismissed, so we can't make them do it, but they'll be like rehabilitative services, employment, educational services, just because those kids were brought in for serious crimes. Maybe they did those crimes, and now they spent time in a correctional facility, didn't necessarily turn their lives around. Now they're going to go back out into your communities. So we reached out to try to provide some help. That's not actually part of our mandate. It's crazy to watch these kids just walk out the front door and then get in trouble again.
Because no one is saying that these youth shouldn't be held accountable. It's just the kind of accountability that we believe is in the best interest, not only the youth, but society at large. You mentioned the 1990s and the legislation really kind of pinning this whole super predator label on some populations. Jump forward to 2019. In 2019, the Maryland General Assembly created this Juvenile Justice Reform Council. And that Juvenile Justice Reform Council had a number of recommendations that it put together that was essentially the foundation of the Juvenile Justice Reform legislation that we're hearing a lot about on the news. Would you mind talking a little bit about that Reform Council and the recommendations that were then adopted in the Juvenile Justice Reform legislation?
Sure thing. So the Reform Council was a bipartisan council. It was made up of legislators, both in the Senate and the House of Delegates, as well as community people, researchers, prosecutors, police, defense attorneys. It was focused on kids accused of nonviolent offenses.
Say that again.
Yeah. It was focused on kids accused of nonviolent offenses and made a whole series of recommendations. Some of them were to not adjudicate or charge kids under the age of 13 for nonviolent offenses, to not incarcerate kids for misdemeanor offenses, low-level offenses, not incarcerate kids for technical violations of probation, so for failing to abide by a rule, things of that nature. And so it passed the House of Delegates and the Senate pretty overwhelmingly, and was enacted into law last June. And since then, I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding about it. One thing that, when I came on, so I come on 6 months later, and there was this big kerfuffle, if you will, about kids under age 13, and the police believing nothing could be done if a kid under the age of 13 did something wrong, right? So, I talked to my staff and said, what's the deal here? Like, I was brand new. I was like, it can't be that nothing can be done. They said, no, we can provide a bunch of services. Police can, or teachers, or social service providers, or parents can refer the kid to us, and then we can just provide them with services. We don't need the court to make us provide them with services. Or there's this process called a SINS process, Children in Need of Supervision, where we could formally go to a judge and say, Judge, we want you to adjudicate this kid as a child in need of supervision, right? So we can do it either way, but in either case, we could just provide services. So I said, well, the police don't seem to know that. Let's tell them. So we set up meetings, big meetings in rooms like this with law enforcement, teachers, social service providers, and parents in every county, including Baltimore County and the city. And we're going to do it again because it's clear people still don't get it. Right? Everybody doesn't know that as good a level as they need to. And we just basically said, you can send us these kids. So what happened then after we did that was there was a 7-fold increase in the number of kids under age 13 that were referred to us, and the amount of arrests they had dropped in half versus the year before because they were getting services. I think partly because they were getting services, and partly because it was just a little serious. Like think of yourself as a 12-year-old. All of a sudden, law enforcement's referring you. So it was kind of in some respects, a shot over the bow. Made the kid realize it was serious. Their families could bring them in, and they could, the family could have a partner in trying to get the kid to the and so, we've had a big increase in the number of kids referred to us, and we would like to have another increase. So we're going to go and knock on those doors again.
I want to ask forgiveness. My chief of staff believes in protocol and the like, and I just kind of jumped into this. But what I would like to do, since we're talking about the General Assembly, we have a few of my colleagues here this evening. Delegate Cheryl Pastor is here, Delegate Ruth, and Delegate McCaskill. So I just want to thank you all for coming out tonight to join in this conversation. And I also see Councilman Pat Young's chief of staff here, so thank you all. But going back to this juvenile justice reform legislation, one of the other pieces that I think has had a little bit of the discussion is around the 10-year-old, youth under 10, not being able to be charged with crimes. I looked at some of the material that was put forth, And in fact, I think what I read was there's in some states it goes as high as 14.
Yeah.
So 10 was actually a compromise. And from the materials that I've read prior to this law being put in place, you sometimes had juveniles as young as 6 who were being arrested. And I don't know, maybe some people believe that 6-year-olds should be handcuffed, but the General Assembly thought that that was unnecessary.
So what the research showed, and this was the research that the commission would see, was that when you formalize cases, when you bring them into court, when you handcuff them, when they sort of be treated like a criminal, little kids especially, self-identify that way. Because think about childhood adolescence is this period where we're struggling with our identity. What kind of man or woman am I going to become, right? And so what we want kids to do is we want them to play sports. We want them to be on the science club. We want them to go to church. We want them to be around mentors so that they can start to think of themselves in that pathway. We don't want them to be in the back of squad cars. We don't want them to have handcuffs on. Before the law passed, it's actually 12 years old. It's 12 and under, right? So before the law passed, the year before, there was 1,700 kids under the age of 13 in Maryland that were arrested. 90% of them were arrested for nonviolent crimes. 4 out of 5 of them were arrested for misdemeanors. But these are pretty low-level crimes, and that's the only people it affects. If you're 12 and you get arrested for a violent offense, you still get arrested. It's just the nonviolent offenses and that the courts can't arrest you for. But like I said, the police, that is, we can still provide them with services, not like they don't get services.
Because if you watch the news media, I think they're conflating the Juvenile Justice Reform legislation, which dealt with nonviolent youth crime, with violent youth crime, and what I believe is scaring people. Just yesterday, I watched Fox, and you can slowly see it's as if they're picking off county executive by county executive, mayor by mayor, who are then making statements as if the General Assembly did not have good information to really come to the choice and the decisions that we made. And as a legislator, that's not to say that any bill is perfect. Anything can be tweaked. But there was good data that was given to us, and we made real logical choices as to why we did what we did.
Baltimore was well represented on that too. State's Attorney Schellenberger was on that commission, and Senator West. There might be more too, but I know those two in particular that were on, they were very active members. They're not shrinking violence, either one of them. Right?
And Senator West is a Baltimore County senator. Talking about Baltimore County, during that hearing with Judiciary, one other delegate from Baltimore County had talked about some media reports of this 11-year-old Baltimore County that police had arrested 17 times. Can you talk a little bit about what can be done for youth under 13 like that juvenile?
Yeah, so that's the kind of case that can often drive public policy. So like I said, 1,700 kids were arrested, 90% of them were nonviolent, right? Most of them were misdemeanors. But this young person, from what I've heard, and all I know about this person is what I see on TV, like you just mentioned. They can be referred to as, sometimes parents don't want the Department of Juvenile Services in their life or their children's life. So that's why we need more than just the Department of Juvenile Services. We need churches, we need boys clubs and girls clubs. We need a lot of things to be able to wrap themselves around this child. But it is true that, under new law, because it's an nonviolent offense, he cannot be prosecuted.
Now, Baltimore County youth victims of non-fatal shootings, it increased from 2 in calendar year 2013 to 15 calendar year 2022. based on calendar year 2023 to date, there have been 8. What is DJS doing to address gun violence for DJS youth?
So a couple of things, I want to mention a couple of things about the data, and then I'll get exactly to that question. A lot of juvenile crime is down versus 10 years ago and 5 years ago. So here in Baltimore County, it's been a 30% decline in juvenile arrests since 2019, or less, including this fiscal year, that's 5 years, right? And that includes person-to-person offenses, violent offenses are down 36%. There are a couple of areas that are up. Gun crime and auto thefts, mainly driven by thefts of Kias and Hyundais, right? And so when I came on board, I literally, I'm carrying around a binder with 31 cases of 31 kids that have been on my caseload that have been shot since I got here, right? Or have shot somebody, but mostly been shot, right? And I've only got like 1,600 kids in the community on my caseload. So you think about a high school with 1,600 kids in it, where 30 of them were shot, and I've only been here 7 months. So that's a state of emergency. And so sometimes I wanna push back against the media for exaggerating things, but not that. Like, that's too many kids getting shot. That's crazy numbers. And so Lisa Gary is the Deputy Secretary for Community Services. She and I sat down and started talking about, exactly what we can do for this, and for particularly kids at high risk of coming to harm from gun violence. And we did a number of things. One is we started looking at what the best practices around the country. We sat down in both Baltimore City and Baltimore County with what we call improvement teams. It's a team of people that are prosecutors, defense attorneys, police, community groups, families, kids, and victims, and said, okay, here's what we think, what do you think? And so we started to cook up ideas. And the one that I think is the most exciting, that will launch either at the end of this month or the beginning of October, is what we call the Thrive Academy. And in Thrive Academy, our staff work with law enforcement, and particularly the sort of formerly incarcerated people that are like violence interrupters, and say, okay, here's who we think is the most at risk. What do you think? Because they know stuff, police know something, the OGs know stuff, we know stuff. So we figured, let's all get together and talk about that. So now we know the ones that we think are the most likely to come to harm. And we're gonna bring them in a room and say, have a respectful conversation with them, explain to them the ramifications of gun violence, which include them coming to harm, them harming somebody, or them going to prison. But then it's not just a lecture. We have what we call a suitcase for success over here. In that suitcase is, we will give you a life coach who will see you every single day and will be on call for you 24/7. That's formerly incarcerated, that's walked in your shoes, and has been trained on how to help you get out of this ugly path you're on. You want to go to college? We'll pay for you to go to college. You want a stipended job? We'll pay Joe the mechanic to hire you until you're good enough for Joe to pay. Your family's in danger, or you're in danger, we'll relocate. And then we'll do fun stuff, camping, museums, ball games, and then trauma therapy too. So young people, usually if you got a gun, you've seen people get killed, you've seen people get shot, you've seen people get beaten. And that level of trauma can make you hypervigilant in ways that are dangerous. So that's in that case for success. And then we're gonna study it, and we're gonna put all our data in front of the committee, this YES committee, this the improvement team. So, and maybe they'll say, you didn't get that right, do it differently. We'll come up with different ways. So that we took a little while to think that through, took a little while to pull the resources together because it's very expensive. It's not gonna be for every kid, it's gonna be for high risk kids. And then that committee is also gonna help us say, all right, what about the medium risk kids? What about the low risk kids? Because there are some low risk kids that have a gun because they think everybody else in the neighborhood's got it. And so they won't get Thrive, but they gotta get something. Because you can't be walking around with a gun, because then there's no fist fights.
Yeah, I had a high school friend who I believe that's what happened. Nicest guy in the world. We were on the wrestling team together. He just kind of disappeared. And years later, I found out that he had been arrested for carrying a gun. And I'm like, I don't know if people carrying a gun, but he was going back into Cherry Hill, and something must have been going on in his community, but he felt he had to protect himself. And when you hear that sort of thing, I mean, I guess if any youth who are one, who's going to protect me? And it really frames the way that me as a legislator, as I look at bills that come forth when people are putting legislation in where they want to throw the book at people.
Senator, when they did that after action report on the Brooklyn shooting, because it reminds me exactly of that, right? The police were called a number of times and didn't come until it was too late. And the kids know that, like they know. And you ask them in our facilities, and we talk to them all the time, like, why are you carrying guns? And they're like, because we gotta protect us. No one else is protecting us right now. And I'm not saying that's always the way the police are, and they were honest to even put that out, which I give them credit for. But if the kids don't think somebody's coming to protect them, they're gonna pack the heat.
It's funny because, and my wife would tell you, when I'm watching the news, I'm hearing people talk about the accountability for the youth. I'm looking at this and I wonder about the accountability for the adults. Obviously, we're not doing what we need to be doing. The children fail, and they have to arm themselves and be safe. So I mean, there's certainly a lot of fingers to be pointing at a lot of people. And again, that's not to take anything away from what those juveniles have done.
Yep, exactly.
But we're not living in a perfect society. We have schools that aren't educating our children, and have violent communities where children feel the need to carry it in order to protect themselves. I mean, just 2 years ago, I watched The Wire for the first time. And I laughed in Baltimore. I thought, being from Baltimore, I said, I just need to watch it. I didn't need to watch The Wire. But it was actually interesting watching, especially that year when they were following the young people going through school, and just you could see the change in this young man who had the world ahead of him, smart young man, and just the world just turned him into stone. He turned his heart into stone. And for those of you, I know there's this Earth, Wind, and Fire song that talks about how children are born with hearts of gold. And we're doing something to them. It's not them, they're a reflection of what we're putting out.
Senator, I was literally on the phone yesterday with a guy named Dominic DuPont, and he is Michael Williams' nephew. And Michael Williams is the guy who played Omar, right? And he's deceased now.
Right.
But when Mr. Williams was still alive, he did a series called Raised by the System on Vice TV. And one of the episodes was around Dominic's life. And Dominic was in prison at the time for a crime committed in Brooklyn, New York, when he was a teenager. And he wants to come and show the documentary to kids in our facilities and just talk to them about the real ramifications of the gun life that many of them and him, when he was a teenager, are involved in. It was really fascinating talking to him because he wasn't making excuses either for himself or these young people. He was saying, yeah, like, you can't do this. Like, it's not okay.
Right.
But we're like, and so I don't want us, and I don't think you are either, like, to be confused with saying this is okay.
Correct.
Or making excuses.
Right.
But we got to step up as grown-ups, and,
Right.
and DJS has our part of this, right? So we got, when young people come to us, either whether they come to our facilities or whether they get probation and stay in the community, we've got to be able to wrap the services around them that they need to pull them out of this life that they're in. It's just the rest of society's got to make that a bit easier too, because it can't be just one department. It's got to be all. It's got to be, and I'm not even saying departments. It's all of us. We got to get the game with these young people, or we're gonna lose that game.
It's the home, family, who are your first teachers. It's your educators, it's all of us. We talked a little bit, just last week, I was at a promotional ceremony for a law enforcement officer friend of mine. We had some conversations about crime from his perspective. And one of the things that we're talking about the crime were these tools or these instruments that you all have in order to make decisions regarding detention of, you have this detention risk assessment instrument. And it's called the intake decision tool.
Yes.
Would you mind? And I think it's the intake decision tool that you all initially use if a youth comes to you all. And again, please correct me if I'm wrong, the detention risk assessment instrument is used, I guess, to determine whether or not a juvenile needs to be incarcerated. Would you mind talking a little bit about both of those tools and correcting me where I would?
Sure. So there's two different decisions that have to happen. One is a detention decision as to whether the kid will be detained until he sees the judge. So we don't detain him for good, right? The judge's got to make that decision. But when the police bring him to us, we can detain him or release him. If a kid comes in on a gun charge, our policy is to always detain him until they see a judge. And that could be tomorrow, but you come in with a gun charge, you're not just walking out. But then for other crimes, we do a risk assessment instrument, which is based on the kid's current charges and their prior record. Have they run away before? Do they have a lot of rearrests, early arrests? And once we do that, it ranks the kids as high, medium, or low risk. And low risk kids we tend not to detain. And then what we do is year after year, we do what's called validating. We look at whether it did or did not predict whether kids really were a likelihood to get rearrested or not show up to court. And it's a validated risk assessment instrument. It predicts 90+% of the times.
This is the intake decision.
No, that's the risk assessment instrument.
Detention risk assessment instrument.
Intake decision tool is a little different. It's decided on two things. One is risk and the other is needs. So risk is this kid risky if we don't formalize their case? Because we're allowed to divert kids just like the police were allowed to divert kids on nonviolent offenses and nonviolent offenses. So on nonviolent offenses, we can divert a kid into treatment immediately. We don't have to go through court and just go right to treatment. But we don't want to just do that based on the gut level decision. So we use a risk assessment type of thing, but it also tells us what kind of needs the kid has. Does this kid need therapy? Does he need drug treatment, or she need anger management therapy? And that helps us guide what we will put them in if we don't formalize their case and have them go to court. So the good thing about that is, it's funny because some people think of it as it's soft on crime when you divert a kid. But one of the good things about it is the kid goes right into something. Whereas if they go to court, they're going to have due process protections. Lawyers are going to argue for a while. It's going to be delayed and take weeks and stuff like that. In this one, they go home, they're in treatment right away.
And with its detention risk assessment instrument, it is about 4 pages. There's a publication that you all publish each year. What is it called? The data resource guide, where the public, you can see what these tools are. The detention risk assessment instrument looks at charges pending adjudication, prior detention, felony complaint, and many other things. The intake decision tool, I'm not going to go through all of the questions. It's like 29 different questions or responses that are scored. Plus, you look at mitigating and aggravating factors, service referrals, and the like. And you touched on it. Age at first offense, misdemeanor referrals, felony referrals, firearm referrals, person-to-person misdemeanor referrals, detention, placement, escape, and it goes on and on.
And also call the victims too, if there's a victim in the case,
Okay.
and ask them what they think.
And from the sense that I got from your testimony, I believe you had said is what juveniles who you all see recidivate, what was it, 14.5, 15%?
Yes.
So these tools are pretty accurate.
Yeah, so 85% of the times they don't consider it. It's just they never make the news. We can have kids graduate from college, right? I was talking to Mayor Scott about this recently, about a shooting near a school.
Mm-hmm.
And he said hundreds of kids graduated from that school in May. And there's a shooting in September and all the media showed up. But in May, none of them were there. And that's true for our kids too. We're graduating kids. We got a bunch of kids going to college right now. They never get in the press. But if one of those kids shot somebody or did something bad, the news crews would beat the ambulance to the scene. And that's frustrating, huh? If you sense frustration in me, you're sensing right. Because that, like my job is to kind of help these young people turn their lives around. And all us grown-ups are only saying bad stuff about them. These young people feel like they're walking around with bullseyes on their back. They got to deal with, all these guns in their neighborhood, and they got to deal with our attitudes. Now, again, if you do bad stuff, you should be held accountable. I'm not trying to make excuses, but we can't just be lambasting these kids day in and day out and expect something good to come from it.
So, again, going back to this theme of accountability, you all have alternatives to detention.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I know here in Baltimore County, we have the Charles Hickey facility. Would you mind just touching on those a little bit with regards to what other alternatives there are rather than putting these youth in behind bars?
Sure. So it's alternatives to detention and alternatives to what we call commitment, which is after you get convicted and sentenced, right? And so there's like a whole range of things that you can do with people. Baltimore County is actually in better shape than most other counties. So we have these evidence-based practices called multisystemic therapy and functional family therapy, where research has shown that if you get involved with the young person and their family, you can reduce their recidivism rates and help them graduate from school. And, there's a lot of positive outcomes. And then there's these mentoring programs, Choice, Youth Advocates Program, and ROCA.
Choices at UMDC.
UMDC, yep. And so those are sort of paraprofessionals. Many of the folks in those programs are formerly incarcerated, but some not. It's not all of them. And they help the kids kind of figure out how to live life in difficult situations. They're mentors, they're role models for them. Some of them are, men who, young people may not have somebody in their life who's a male role model for them, and that kind of helps them. They help them with stipended jobs. I went to there's an ice cream stand, if you haven't been, folks, at the kind of bottom end of the Inner Harbor. That's all run by these kids. Yeah, and there's someone going upstairs to kind of watch them, but it's very good ice cream. So, that's like when I got my first job, my father worked at Pan Am Airlines. So one of my first jobs was cleaning toilets on planes. Now, I was no better at cleaning toilets on planes than anybody else, but my father helped me get that job, right?
Right.
And one of his buddies. And so some of these young people, they don't have that. And so these programs, they can help them get entree into jobs that maybe my father helped me get, and maybe they don't have that kind of entrance. So
I'm going to remind the audience, if you all have any questions, Eugene, he has some cards. If you have any questions, please, from anything that we've said this evening, that stoked any questions, just raise your hand. Gene will come around with the card, write those questions, and those cards will be collected as we begin winding down the questions that I had received prepared. We will take some questions that you all in the audience may have had, okay? So can you talk about the DJS continuum of services? One of the things that I thought I heard you say to Delegate Embry was that you all had enough resources. Could you speak to that? Or are there gaps that you see in the continuum of care that we may need to address?
So I think that TJS has a decent budget, right? We have a $322 million budget and about 2,000 kids under our care. So if you do that math, it's almost $150,000 per kid per year. It's a real substantial amount of money.
Right.
Unfortunately, I think that as time went on over the last decade, communities didn't get too much of that money. So it really kind of goes to the bureaucracy more than it goes out into the communities. And I think that's a problem. And that's not just true of us, that's true of the Department of Health, that's true of social services. It kind of nested within the bureaucracy as opposed to partnering with communities. So one example is in Maryland, there is not one, you're gonna find this hard to believe, there's not one residential drug treatment program in the state of Maryland for adolescents, right? So you think about all the stuff you're hearing about with OxyContin and opioids, all this mushroom over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years, and we don't have a residential treatment program. There was one up in Sabillsville, just outside of Victor Cullen, one of our correctional facilities, and I went and looked at it the other day. It's almost like people just walked out of it in 2019. It's like the coffee cups are still on people's desks, and it's actually in good shape. It doesn't leak. The building's fine. There's just not a program in it anymore. And you have kids in my facilities and in hospitals that can't go anyplace because there's no place to take them. And so we have a lot of rebuilding with the community to do and partnering with the community. We just issued it's called a NOFA. It's like a request for proposals. It's a competitive thing, but it's for a grant.
A notice of funding availability.
Notice of funding availability, right? And for Baltimore County and Baltimore City, just for the Thrive program to provide that life coaching.
When does that close?
It closed.
It's already closed, okay.
What's the name of the group that got it in Baltimore County? Continuous Growth.
Okay.
So like a real grassroots group. That's so far, we're still involved in training and selecting kids.
Okay.
But they are leaning in, they're like eager, and they have never had this relationship with us before. And I want to do more of that, because when you do that, not only, in my view, do you help the kids, but then you start to build up the community. There's a lot of talent in our communities, and if folks can get these jobs and then start to involve themselves with these young people, then not only does it help the kid, but it kind of helps the community in a lot of ways. I mean, when I was growing up in Brooklyn, in New York, my mother used to let me go out at like 6 o'clock, as a 6-year-old, and come back when the lights come on, right? Down the street, because everybody on my block was my mother, right? Like, it wasn't just my mother. Like, they all could tell me what to do. And if I gave them lip, my mother found out about it. And some of them didn't have phones. It was like a miracle, And so, because we're cohesive communities.
Right.
And I think that when we pull back from that, because we got flat screen TVs, we got air conditioning, so we're not sitting on our stoops anymore, but also because we're afraid of the kids,
right.
then we have to rely on the government and police and correctional facilities and probation officers. And we're never going to be as good as the community. So as far as I'm concerned, if I can push some of the resources back and be a good partner, which government isn't always, so I'm gonna have to work on that, because sometimes we act like we know everything, whereas the people in the neighborhoods know a ton.
Right.
And often more about those young people than we do, and often they care more because it's their neighborhoods. I'm going to Tone Park after this is over, right? And so if we can push some of our resources to the communities and be good partners, I think that will do better by young people and their families and their neighbors.
Now, you all had a publication that recently came out where you did a kick of the tires of DJS, and I know the Baltimore Sun, they wrote an editorial about it. They had a number of people, law enforcement and the like, kind of questioning the data. The Baltimore Sun, I believe, within their editorial, they had asked a question about what kind of interventions are working and which are not. Would you mind speaking to that?
Sure. So we have a bunch of evidence-based programs I mentioned earlier, multi-systemic therapy, functional family therapy, and the mentoring programs, ROCA, Youth Advocates, and Choice. Those have also all have good data behind them that are reducing recidivism. And then that's in the community for the kids. But then we have correctional facilities too. And those facilities, we just launched kind of a cognitive behavioral therapy called dialectical behavioral therapy. Sorry, all these technical names, but the theory behind it is that young people are impulsive, particularly men, young men, right, males. We're impulsive, and particularly impulsive in emotionally charged settings, but not in non-emotionally charged settings, which is why you can have a rational conversation with your 16-year-old son about the philosophy class he's taken in school, and him and his buddies go do knucklehead stuff, right? Because when they get together and things get hot,
You have a lot of group things.
right? And so you can actually train young people to stop and think, and to not throw that punch, and to use techniques that will keep them out of sort of deep end violent trouble. And there's good research on that. So we launched that in all of our correctional facilities. I think it was May. It took a little while to train people and stuff like that. And I would say that was an imperfect launch, right? Staff is used to doing things their own way, you know, don't change cultures of, you know, by pressing a button. But we're retraining folks and we're staying on it and we're kicking the tires. But right now, the recidivism rates have declined in our for kids coming out of our correctional facilities, and they've declined for kids on probation. So it's not perfect. 18% in Baltimore County still means 82% of kids don't get rearrested. They all came to us for arrest, so that's better than it was before. But 18% is a number I'm not happy with, and we're going to keep driving that down.
And you say that's 18% in Baltimore County.
Yes.
So, and from what I understand, the recidivism rate here in Baltimore County is slightly higher than the rest of the state for youth on probation and committed to your department. What do you think we're missing for those youth?
Yeah, I don't actually think it's because you're missing something. I think it's the opposite. There's a pretty good diversion program that the police use in Baltimore County, joints. And I think what happens is your police already divert out the easy kids, where some other places like, you know, you go on the Eastern Shore, you're getting all those kids. So they make you look better on the Eastern Shore or Western Maryland, because anybody can work with those kids. Your police, thankfully, I think it's good. They don't refer them to DJS because they have programs for them. And from what I understand, those are pretty successful programs.
Great. It's good to hear. And the briefing in front of the Judiciary Committee, you had mentioned, like you said, 87% of youth charged as adults are waived down to the juvenile system. You noted that these juveniles generally do not get the benefit of services because they do begin in the adult system. This lack of services isn't good for anybody, and I think that's what you had said, right? If they began in the juvenile system, those services, would they be accessible to those people?
Yeah, except for the ones whose cases are dismissed. They're still going to get dismissals. But one of the things that people need to know is when a kid is automatically charged as an adult and the police arrest them, they go to jail. So all of them, no matter what's going to end up happening, their case could be dismissed 3 days later. They're going to get jail experience. And there's not one piece of research that says that's a good thing to do to a kid. Now, if a kid's getting a 20-year sentence, that's one thing. Like, I'm not saying that's okay, but most 87% of the times that's not what's happening. Right. And so why start them there and bring them this way? Why not start them with us? The judges can make the same exact decisions. They can still decide, but the kids have done serious stuff to put them in the adult system. But why put 87% of them through that if they're never going to end up there anyway?
Right, and that's been a major problem that I recall coming up, bubbling up during session. Here in Baltimore County, we had youth who were sitting in our Baltimore County Detention Center, where I think, if I recall correctly, our member of the Office of Public Defender came to some of us legislators, and you had the corrections saying that this facility wasn't built to hold youth. And they have an obligation to keep those youth safe. So how do you keep youth safe in adult facilities? Well, they were just kind of secluding them, which was unhealthy. And I can't help but think about the young man who I think was in Rikers Island for supposedly stealing a backpack, who essentially he went insane because of him being secluded. Right, he never got over that, even when they let him out.
That's right. It's suicide. You know, I went through my resume real quick, but for Mayor de Blasio's last 7 months, things were so off the hook at Rikers Island that he let his corrections commissioner go and hired me. So I ran Rikers Island for the final 7 months of Mayor de Blasio's term. And the saddest part of it was the adolescent youth, where the kids were. And there's just no question these kids are learning lessons in there that our society should not be teaching them.
Right.
Now, like I said, if they're gonna do 20 years, then it's a different story. Even though I'm not saying anybody should have to go through that, but if they're coming right back out, it really behooves us not to put them through that, because they're just not to self-identify as a criminal. And you know, they wear that when they come out. I mean, anybody knows that. Like, they come out and now all of a sudden they got a reputation uphold. Whereas if they were just in juvie, it's a big difference.
Right. And one of the things that have come up that many of us don't think about, and here in the state of Maryland, the state has a constitutional obligation to ensure that our juveniles, our youth, you're under 18, you have to teach them. They have to get educated. And we were finding, or there had been some allegations that the youth who were being incarcerated, they weren't being properly incarcerated. So if you wouldn't mind, can you talk a little bit about DJS's relationship with local school systems, specifically in Baltimore County? You know, there's been some conversations around this MOU being in place with Juvenile Services Education Program in Baltimore County Public Schools. Is that MOU in place?
Yeah, it's in place with every county, including Baltimore County. So what happened was a year and a half ago now, it was June of 22, again, 6 months before I got here. The legislature passed legislation to take education in our facilities away from the State Department of Education and put them into the Juvenile Services Education Program, which we are the back office for, but it's an independent school, just like Baltimore County's school system is. So it's the 25th school district in Maryland.
Okay.
Right? 23 counties, Baltimore City, and us. And it's got a school board, which I'm a member of, an independent superintendent, Kim Pogue. And so that's been going now for a year and 3 months. We have some challenges of recruiting teachers, particularly in counties where the teachers in the county make more than my teachers. So like out west, we're fine, right? Because our teachers get paid way more than they get paid in Garrett County. But in Baltimore County, Baltimore City, Prince George's, where we have a vacancy rate. Part of what JSEP's been doing since for the first about 9 months was to work with every school district in the state to get an MOU to make it easier for the kids to go back to school. The record of juvenile detention and getting kids back into school once they've been in is terrible. Kids just drop off the table when they come back out because they're frustrated. They weren't having a great experience, a lot of them, with school to begin with. Now they've been out of it. They've been in juvie. Everybody kind of, even though it's confidential, everybody knows it.
You have a lot of adults who don't want them there.
They don't want them.
They don't have
some of them.
Right.
So I mean, you know, we're working that out though. It's only been 9 months. We've got the MOU with everybody. So my people are in there with your teachers in Baltimore County, with your administrators. You know, every once in a while there's a problem, we disagree because the kids doing something, it scares everybody. But at the end of the day, it's their obligation to educate people, so we don't back down on it.
Great. Did we have some questions from the audience?
Absolutely.
We do have some. So as they bring those questions up, I do thank you for answering, and I believe putting out a good bit of information, knowledge, challenge. I think this information that is out there. But the Child Interrogation Protection Act. I'm not going to ask the secretary this question solely because, and whoever wrote this, I'm more than happy to talk to you about it. But the reality is the Interrogation Protection Act is something that affects law enforcement, police officers, not the department. Am I correct? And when we looked at the legislation, when the legislation came forth, while DJS spoke to Juvenile Justice Reform Act, there was no testimony from the agency on this bill. I want to talk about this. I'm not going to hold it to the secretary. So whomever asks this question, let's make sure we get together.
So if any of you have Netflix and you've not seen that Central Park 5 series, I think it's number 3, where the kids go in, they're all adolescents, and they confess to this crime they didn't commit that was later proven. It's really instructional for like, I'm not an expert. It's like you said, this doesn't really touch me, but watch that one because it's just incredible to watch these young people confess to something, and every single one of them confessed.
Yeah,
I
was on a radio program, and I think it surprised one of the listeners, but what I have shared with people, because I was a sponsor on that legislation, and people don't believe this, but the framers did not intend to make it easy for government to prosecute people. That's why you have the Fifth Amendment, which guarantees what? Right? Yeah, you don't want to incriminate yourself. And then what did they do? They added a Sixth Amendment that did what? Gave us the right to counsel. So the Child Interrogation Protection Act, instead of relying on case law that the Supreme Court created and the Supreme Court slowly has been chipping away at, and we have Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, who I don't think is necessarily a fan of Miranda. They all have said this is what legislatures should do. So that's what the legislature did. We codified Miranda to make certain that children are protected. And the thing that I think surprises a lot of people, it was about 2 years ago, I remember, we tried to put legislation in that would prohibit lying during an interrogation. People don't realize that law enforcement is allowed to lie to you during an interrogation. Most children that I know, if an adult tells them something, that child is going to believe what that adult says. And when you're lied to, maybe, I think I was just reading something about a juvenile who was being interrogated for like 7 hours. And after that time, look, you just got to tell us you did it. We'll let you go home. I did it. And the child didn't do it. So I got plenty to say about it, but I told the secretary we're going to stick into our topic. So
and I started. So
see,
I couldn't let it go. It's kind of high and outside.
So it's interesting as I've talked to some of my constituents. In fact, I was at a family function a few weeks ago, and this question gets to it. Like, well, what about the parents? Why are we not holding parents accountable for crimes children under 10 may be committing? I don't know if you have a response to that. What I've shared with people is, do you want to really be held accountable for your juvenile, the worst thing that your child might have done? I mean, what do you think about that?
You know, I mean, it's not just the families, because there's, you know, kids go out in their communities and there's all sorts of temptations around them. Like I said, there's a lot of guns as well. And, you know, kids can be taken away from their family, both by our system and by the child welfare system. For most parents I know, that's pretty awful when your kid gets taken away from you. So I think, you know, every once in a while, there's gonna be a television show that shows some unfeeling mother. That's not my general experience with mothers. My general experience with mothers is they don't want their kids to get locked up. They don't want their kids to get in trouble. And I too often, systems like mine go into these families and these communities like we know better. And I think that's a setup for failure. So I think that my job should be to encourage families to join forces with us, rather than us to view them like they're the enemy.
Right. The Secretary mentioned the need for community-based organizations to provide services and resources in addition to DJS. Is there funding to grow these services?
Yeah, I think there is. My agency has been giving money back to the state every year. I think we gave back $15 million even before I got here, right? Think about that, delegate. I see your reaction. So, I mean, how crazy is that? Like, they got all the needs these kids have. And, you know, I go to judges all over the state and they're like, we need more services for these young people. So with Deputy Secretary Gary, we've been sort of scouring our system to capture as much money as we can, push it into the community. We just gave out our first grants ever. The department had never given a grant before. We can get a grant out in 2 weeks. You do an RFP, it takes like 9 months, right? So when kids get a shot, we don't have 9 months. And so we push this money out to We Are Us and continuous growth. Right? And we're gonna do more and more of that. But we wanna do it in partnership with the community, because I don't wanna sit in my office in downtown Baltimore and vent what Salisbury needs. I'm pretty sure they know better in Salisbury what they need than in Baltimore County. So that takes a little time, but that partnership pays off.
Let's see, there's a question. What is the status of the MOU on housing the children in Towson Detention Facility, where they had been held in solitary confinement, denied adequate education, healthcare, required to pay $4 to see a doctor, or so forth? Let's see. Secretary said release back into the community with no services. Do you all play a role in that particular MOU? No.
That's because that's the county.
That's the county
jail.
So that's a different MOU. Thank you. Let's see. What measures are you taking to adjust the way in which your $322 million budget is better utilized to service the community? Short-term and long-term timelines.
Yeah, so exactly. So short-term will be this fiscal year, right? So we're looking at all the vacancies, and before I fill vacancies within my department, I'm saying, do I need that? Do I need that job? Right. So right now, there are 7 layers of supervision between me and a frontline caseworker, a probation officer, and 8 layers of supervision between me and a frontline worker in one of my facilities. 8 layers. I'm thinking maybe if we had 5 layers, we'd be okay. I don't know. Like, we got supervisors. And so I'm wondering, like, as some of them come vacant, you know, each one is going to be, when you add benefits in, 150,000. You get 10 of those vacancies, that's $1.5 million. It's a pretty good program. So we're scouring our staffing complement and doing other things like nobody even knows the phone number on their desk anymore, right? Like, literally, and that's like a lot of money. It's like $100,000 worth of desk phones that nobody uses. So if we can just kind of scour the place and see if we can, because we're not going to get more money, right? At some point, like the budget statewide is anticipating a deficit. The governor's spoken eloquently about that, and so we can't just go to the governor. Everybody's going with their hands out. At some point, the governor's going to run dry. You know this. Yes. So what I got to look internally and figure out with my leaders well, what really do we need in here? And what would better be done in partnership with community? So that's constantly what we're doing. Literally 7 months now, we've frozen some positions, and we're working with Department of Budget and Management to see if we can convert them, which I thought would be easy, but apparently it's not. So, I'm working on stuff for
Got you. Let's see, has the city or county thought about forming specialized court for juveniles to offer residential care that offers on-site mental health services that are trauma informed? So we have juvenile court, but do they offer residential care?
We have 3 residential facilities, and this year we launched trauma-informed care and dialectical behavioral therapy. That's what we call the comprehensive treatment model. And I'm not gonna take credit for that. The previous guy thought this up. Georgetown helped provide technical assistance. So when I got here, my staff was working on it. I kicked the tires on it. I knew the people at Georgetown. I talked to them about it. And so, we proceeded. I signed the policies for it. We launched it. As I said, it was an imperfect launch, but because correctional systems aren't necessarily therapeutic places, always, because there's this tension between being a CO and being a therapist. But bit by bit, we're training the staff, coming on board. The ones that don't like it are heading out the door, because some people didn't sign up for that, which is okay.
Right.
It's not for everybody. And so, we've launched it. I think it's good. I think it's gonna be great one day, but right now it's good.
And we have one last question. Great. You can name drop my. Define violent versus non-violent crimes.
Violent is person to person. If you either harm somebody or threaten to harm somebody. So carjacking, robbery, assault, obviously shooting guns at people, all of that is violent crimes. Things that aren't violent or car theft, even though harm can come from it. But if there's nobody with the car and you steal it, that would be a non-violent crime. Petty theft from stores. Petty theft from stores is a big one for kids. They get arrested for that a lot.
Right. And to whomever asked that question, I will also direct you to criminal law article section 14-101. There are 26 crimes of violence. 26. The secretary touched on some of them, but since we have a little bit of time, I'll tell you what they are. Abduction, arson in the first degree, kidnapping, manslaughter, except for involuntary manslaughter, mayhem, maiming, armed carjacking, sexual offense in the first degree, sexual offense in the second degree, use of a firearm in the commission of a felony except possession with intent to distribute a controlled dangerous substance, child abuse in the first degree, under 601 and 3602, home invasion, felony offense under Title 3, Subtitle 11, which I'm not certain what that is, an attempt to commit any crime described that I just described above, continuing course of conduct with a child under 3-315, and you need a law book to go through some of these things. Assault with intent to murder, assault with intent to rape, assault with intent to rob, assault with intent to commit a sexual offense in the first degree, and assault with intent to commit a sexual offense in the second degree. Those are your crimes of violence. So with that, Mr. Secretary, I want to thank you for taking your time out of your schedule this evening to talk with us and to educate us about a pretty hot topic. And I appreciate you keeping your word with me and coming to visit District 44. I thank you all for coming out tonight. Hopefully you learned something. We can get on top of this false narrative out there. So thank you all. Have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Senator.